Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Cassetta Taco presentation on the Everett Spruce exhibit at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth. I am Scott Chase, and I am the brand new board chair, all of 6 days, of Cassetta, and I'm very proud to be the board chair for Cassetta. In addition to welcoming you today, I also want to make sure I thank Sarah Beth Wilson for her wonderful service as 3 years as a board chair for Cassetta, and also thank Sarah Beth for her excellent tech support today on this Zoom conference. Thank Sarah Beth for all this work on making sure we're all in this presentation. She will be a hard act to follow, I know that. If you're not a member of Cassetta, I hope you will join. And if you have any questions or comments today, please use the chat app because Sarah Beth will be able to take those Q&A and chats and pass them on to Shirley Hughes. Without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Russ Aikman for him to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Scott. So first, I just want to thank Cassetta for this first joint meeting with Taco. We hope this is the first of additional meetings that we'll do jointly in the future. Opens up lots of opportunities for doing that. Thanks to Howard Taylor, as Executive Director, for his support of what we're doing here today. I'd also like to thank the Amon Carter Museum of American Art for doing this particular show. Andrew Walker, the director, committed his support to Texas Art when he joined the museum back in 2011. And with this particular exhibition, which was specifically requested, he is honoring that commitment. We appreciate that. I know for collectors all over the state, this has been something we've been looking forward to for many years. I'd like to introduce our speaker now, Shirley Hughes, who is the curator of painting and sculpture at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. Shirley got her PhD in art history back in 2006. Joined the Amon Carter in 2009, and she's been very, very busy since that time. So too many things for me to try to cover here. I'll just mention some of the noteworthy things that she has done. 2013, she curated the first gallery focused on Texas art and had a series of different exhibitions focused on different Texas artists with different themes. In 2017, she curated a show, The Invented Worlds of Balton Tyler, really unique and different show, highlighting that artist who's relatively less known, better known now. 2018 curated a show, Commanding Space, Women Sculptors of Texas. And in the following year, 2019, spearheaded the reinstallation of all the 20th century art at the museum. So, as I said, very, very busy, very successful in what she's done. She's done a fabulous job with this particular exhibition. For those who are not local to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, this is a must-see show. You need to make a road trip to the Amon Carter to see this show. I highly recommend it. Also did a great job on the catalog. I'll just mention one of the things Taco does is to support research on early Texas art. And we made a sizable donation towards this catalog to help offset some of the cost in putting it together. And it is a wonderful catalog, highly illustrated, great essays and information in there. So something for your bookshelf. So without further ado, I want to turn this over to Shirley, and looking forward to her talk today.
Hi, thank you so much, Russ, for that introduction. And thank you, Scott Chase. I also want to thank Sarah Beth Wilson so much for organizing this and keeping me calm during my technological panic earlier. So I really appreciate everyone's help with this, and this is really exciting. So I first want to start off with a few more thank yous. Texas Made Modern is supported by the Gaydon Family Foundation, the Summerlee Foundation, and the Alice L. Walton Foundation Temporary Exhibitions Endowment. Support for the exhibition catalog comes from the Texas Art Collectors Organization. Thank you very much, Taco. And the Amon Carter would especially like to thank the exhibition's corporate sponsor, Heritage Auctions. I also want to thank the private collectors who kept Spruce's name and legacy alive. And as Russ mentioned in his introduction, got familiar with Andrew when he came on board and brought up this really important topic of looking at Spruce in depth, because he's definitely an artist that deserves it. And I felt very fortunate to work on it. So I thank all of those collectors, especially to those who opened up their homes and they shared their insights with me about Spruce. That was really helpful to me. I also want to thank Spruce's family members who were instrumental in helping Henry Spruce, his children, Henry Spruce and Alice Spruce Merriweather, who talked with me about their father's interest and their father's work. And I deeply appreciate Alice Spruce Merriweather in particular sharing her father's scrapbooks with me, and so much of his resources, some of his early library that really helped with the research on my project. So without further ado, I'm going to start out. I hope that you all can make it to Fort Worth, but these are very difficult times, as we all know. And so I'm going to do sort of a virtual tour of the exhibition first, so that hopefully for those of you who don't get to see it, you'll have a chance to get a feel for what it looks like. So as you enter the exhibition, you'll see this introductory wall where you have two of Spruce's sort of iconic West Texas landscape paintings, because that really was, West Texas was so much the inspiration over his lifetime. And the exhibition actually has two entrance points. I want to point out, for those of you who haven't had a chance to come to the museum, we closed part of spring and summer of 2018, or spring and summer 2019, so that we could reopen in the fall. And we have renovated the galleries. You can, if you haven't, if it's been a while, you may look at the floors. We've got brand new floors, brand new lighting, a bigger special exhibition space. That's where Spruce is, upstairs, so that we could do more exhibitions. And also it's a better space for just even the permanent collection, so we can highlight the art in such a really beautiful manner that it deserves. So there's the entrance I first showed you was coming from a special exhibition that's up right now called Acting Out, Cabinet Cards and the Making of Modern Photography. And for those of you all interested, you get two for the price of one. You can come see Spruce, and you can come see the Cabinet Cards exhibition. Cabinet Cards is like the first format for portraiture, the last 3 decades of the 19th century. Really fascinating, fun images, almost the precursor to the selfie. So you can also come into the exhibition from the permanent collection galleries, as you see there. And here's another angle. This takes you deep into the second gallery of the show. So the show is in 2 big main galleries upstairs. And then the exhibition starts. It's a loose chronological flow, but it also reflects Spruce's travels. So it starts out his roots in Arkansas, have an early Arkansas painting, and then after coming to Dallas, the way he starts progressing and looking at Texas art. And this is kind of one of the introductory walls that takes you through that. Then you look at that other wall of the background, you see his West Texas landscapes, and it takes you through, this is the flip side of that baffle wall. And then the back side, I thought it was essential to incorporate some of Spruce's really important quotes that reflected kind of the essence of what he was trying to accomplish in his artwork. So there's one quote up there about very early, I felt an intimacy with nature that has influenced whatever I have said or wanted to say in painting. And there you see another angle, some of the works on view. And this is going through the first gallery. And then we start progressing into after he moves to Austin in 1940, and you start to see a significant shift in his work. He's experimenting stylistically. I mean, Spruce was very open to modernist ideas. I think that's one of the things that really differentiated Spruce, is that He was very attuned to what he wanted to express, but he was also very willing to experiment. And so looking into the gallery, the second gallery, which progresses through towards closer to the end of his career, but there you see in the middle is this early screen he did, Catalpa landscape. It was a room divider. And you can see even then, that's about 1929. He was in Dallas, still very much a young student. He's trying to interconnect nature. That ribbon in the sky connects to the stream below. And then you see this is moving, I called this section Beyond Observation, where he's still grounded in nature, but he's really moving beyond sort of those earlier scenes that what he's known for, the typical West Texas, and expanding his subject matter, moving into animal life a little bit more, wildlife. And there's a second quote that I put up in these later galleries, and looking at just the marvelous way he evolved, and moving not completely to abstraction, but just such a sophisticated painter. I mean, I go out into the galleries and look at his paintings again because his brushwork is truly magnificent, and he just really deserves to be brought back and looked more closely in the history of American art. So, and this is a flip side of that baffle wall as you walk in. That's a late work that I'll talk about a little bit later. But I'm going to start my talk now, and I wanted to provide you with a few images of Spruce. And you all, I know you all are so knowledgeable about Spruce, so I just wanted to give you all a bit of a background. He was born in 1908 in Arkansas near Conway. And when he was 3 years old, the family relocated to Adams Mountain, where they grew apple and peach orchards. And then by the time he was in high school, they moved to a region just north of Mulberry, Arkansas, where they harvested corn and cotton. And I think so much of his work ethic comes from that farming background. I mean, he was very much of a worker, very much of a doer in his life. And then really he developed a philosophical view of nature during his upbringing in Arkansas. And what's interesting is when he was coming of age in Arkansas, Texas was still associated with a lot of frontier myths in the American imagination. If you think about turn of the 20th century America and how Texas was thought of, I mean, it was still thought of from dime novels, the cowboys and the rangers and the Indians. And when we look at the history of Texas art, really the first artist to achieve national acclaim was Frank Ray. And he kept that cowboy tradition alive, that idea of the romantic promise of frontier progress and the American cowboy as sort of the last heroic settler. And if you look at his sweeping plains and broad skies, his work really evoked these unbounded horizons. It's almost like an imagined utopia still existed in this frontier land of Texas to Americans in their minds. And then the other really most important style in the 20th century, an artist from Texas who achieved national acclaim, was Julian Onderdonk, and of course most famous for his impressionist scenes of bluebonnets. But Spruce was really never followed that trend. He wanted to create his own original language. And for him, nature was very much a wellspring of knowledge, discovery, and mystery. And so he created really, as I'll talk about today in this more as I go along, kind of his own motifs, his own visual vocabulary of expressing the wonder that he saw in nature. So one of the things that comes up again and again for Spruce is this rock formation, this forested escarpment from Mulberry, Arkansas. And after Spruce was in rural Arkansas, some of you probably know the story that Olin Travis and his partner, Catherine Hale Travis, were traveling through Arkansas. A fortuitous introduction to Spruce. Spruce showed them their drawings, and on the strength of his drawings alone, he was invited to the Dallas Art Institute. So he started there in 1926, but Spruce was still going home to visit family. And so he painted this particular watercolor between 1927 and 1929. And I'll show you later how it comes up again and again in his, even his West Texas landscapes and the reasoning behind that. But when we think about spruce, one of his iconic symbols was the single tree, the dead hollow tree. And this is an early work from 1932. And he created it, this was during the height of the Dust Bowl. And if the title of it tells you anything, veteran, it's the idea that the subject, this hollowed out oak tree, is a casualty of the worn-torn area of the dust storms. And one of the things that Spruce does throughout his career is he really never makes overt political statements. You know, when you think about Alexander Hogue and his erosion series, you know, Hogue was really making a commentary about mankind's failure in terms of land management and all that had happened. And you really never see that kind of political commentary coming from Spruce. What he did, I think, was convey what was happening in the world, what was happening during the Great Depression through nature. That nature becomes his language. And so one of the things that really was helpful to me in talking to Alice Spruce Merriweather was looking at Spruce's early library. And so the books that he had were a well-worn copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and then he also had books by Henry David Thoreau and William Butler Yeats. And though their poetry was quite diverse, each of those artists depicted themselves as spiritual beings in their writings. And I think this model kind of helped Spruce foment his landscape painting, because like Thoreau and like Whitman, Spruce looked upon nature as having a sacred meaning that could be directly perceived, particularly with Thoreau in Walden or Life in the Woods, published in 1854. The poet really, he went out into the woods, built his own cabin. There's an original drawing by his sister for one of the original publications, the idea of living in the bare bones in nature and discovering those spiritual truths by becoming one with nature. And for Thoreau, which was always what he says in Walden, is always to be alert, to always be looking at what may not be easily perceived at first. And by doing so, you could find much more within the natural environment. And at the basis was this idea that the nature represented the physical manifestation of God or higher power. And I believe that Spruce looked at nature in that same way. And so in 1935, Spruce, I'm going to have to get a drink of water once in a while. Spruce makes his first trip to Big Bend, to West Texas. And at that moment, you know, Big Bend was getting a lot of press coverage in the Dallas Morning News. It was kind of considered one of these last frontiers. It was advertised like that. And what is fascinating about Big Bend is, you know, it's millions of years of tectonic shifts that caused those unusual juxtapositions of desert and mountain and river. And all the variety of rocks, the sedimentary rocks of limestone, shale, sandstone, predominate the park even today. And I think that was really fascinating to Spruce to go out and look at that. I also think that Frank Ray, who was known for taking his students out west, as many of you all know, took so many students out west to study West Texas and look at that arena. Spruce never traveled with Ray, and I don't think that his work influenced Spruce, but I think the model of Ray going out to West Texas, as so many artists that were in Spruce contemporaries did, whether it was Alexander Hogue or Otis Dozier, who Spruce was friends with, had an impact on him. And so this idea of kind of a last America's frontier, and by the way, under the New Deal Roosevelt administration, because of this attraction to Big Bend, he sent a civilian corps of men out in 1933. They built an infrastructure. So by 1935, when Spruce goes there, there's actually a roadway where he can travel along and get to see, you know, many of the park sites. And so one of his first works is this rare finished drawing entitled bear cave. And I think it's both an observed and sort of an imagined reconfiguration of a bear habitat. And in many ways, like Thoreau, what Spruce did throughout his career is depict uncultivated nature. That was which was in the raw. And Thoreau sort of put a warning saying he believed that all meadows should be left wild and not dug up or not treated, because he, this is coming from a 19th century perspective, believed that tampering with nature, you didn't know what you were coming upon. And so I believe, Spruce subscribed to this belief, and that's what you see in his career, primarily depicting these raw, uncultivated scenes. And the other thing that Spruce followed that was in part of Thoreau's thinking was that idea of looking at the interconnectedness of nature. So here, within this particular drawing, you have Spruce depicting the soft foliage. You see the trees, the cedars, and the pine trees kind of growing out of fissures, in both horizontal and vertical directions. And Spruce, because of his upbringing on the farms, he really understood nature. I think he was an amateur naturalist. I think he understood ecology. And I think in many ways, he understood these trees were lithophytes. They show up time and again in his paintings, that lithophytes kind of the roots grow towards any nutrient source. And so there's kind of this subtlety of knowing, as he did, that these trees would ultimately kind of cause erosion over time in the stone. So there's this subtle ecology going on in Spruce's work. And you see it even in his later work. In the 1940s, he starts painting wildlife, birds, and he's looking at those interrelationships of what's happening. And here in the gathering, it's a cluster of band-tailed pigeons, and they're perched on the limbs of gamble oaks in Big Bend. And you see Spruce's mastery in his style, in that he's aligning the forms of the fowl with the shape of the oak leaves. But the pigeons, there's also a reference here that the pigeons needed the heat-yielding oak leaves for shelter and sustenance. And then in turn, the birds distributed the oak seeds, stimulating the tree growth that provided watershed protection in that particular area. You see it also in paintings like the coon, where you have an animal foraging in the Rio Grande, perched on a rock that tilts upward in the canvas. And this is a reflection too of not only Spruce being aware come the 1940s, as more and more artists were treating the canvas as a flat substrate, pushing that rock up, but also the fact that he's evoking the idea that coons are typically nighttime animals. And so it's interesting that when this was exhibited in New York City, a critic wrote that Spruce knows the habits and the habitats of the things he paints. So I think that was really novel at the time, being on view in New York City. Another work like Rain in Texas, you don't see actual rain in the picture, but the river is full to the edges. A small tributary breaks off from the stream. The cloudy skies and rich green foliage suggest recent rainfall. Going back to some of his earlier work, it's interesting how in the 30s, there's very much an iconography that he creates that reappears over and over again. And this particular stillness that you see that was characteristic of these works, in some ways, this Llano River characterizes that arid region, but in many ways, it's also a reflection, a suggestion of the paralyzing effects of not only the weather conditions of the Great Depression, but the economic downturn. This use of an isolated tree as a metaphoric symbol also finds parallels in the work of the Italian Quattrocento artist that Spruce loved, which was Andrea Mantegna, and his brother-in-law Giovanni Bellini, who both deployed a lifeless tree as an omen of Christ's fate in their interpretations of the agony in the garden, which was the New Testament story of Jesus's last night of freedom in the Garden of Gethsemane. Mantegna began working on his agony in the garden, and here's Bellini's, a few years before Bellini began his. So it's believed that Bellini sort of took a lot of those compositional devices from his brother-in-law. And Spruce said of Bellini and Mantegna's work, quote, "Their landscapes look to me like this country down here in West Texas. I made a connection there," end quote. So what you see happening is Spruce borrowing some of these compositional devices. One of them being, you see the log down in the corner of the picture in Agony in the Garden, where that log, it's going over the canalized brook, is taking you to the three disciples. It's also taking you to the figure of Christ who's in the middle of prayer. And in Spruce's work with the log, he's taken the same sort of device, but the log is taking you deep into the picture plane. And so the tree, in Spruce's estimation, is more of an ominous reminder of what is happening during the Great Depression, but also it's also a sense of the cycle of nature. You see some green blossoms in the back. There's a hope. There's a hope for renewal that he's trying to communicate. But I also think that Spruce was very much interested in time. And so a lot of his Big Bend pictures, you see this, and even you could consider it here, this idea of the millions of years of erosion that sort of evoke the geological evolution that's happened in West Texas. So in West Texas, what we have is a West Texas landscape is a dugout, as you can see it coming around this particular mesa. And it's drawing our attention by doing that. Spruce is drawing our attention to these dramatic landforms. And he's doing this in the same way that Mantegna did it in his, I'll move my cursor, kind of this canalized brook, which is around the figures that takes you into this. So what's interesting here is the way that Spruce has taken some of these elements, but you don't, and you rarely see figures in Spruce's paintings. So for Spruce, what's happening is that nature stands in for Christ's fate. There is a drama to nature that Spruce is envisioning. And here you see the broken off platform that Christ kneels at. Here's Spruce's version, the isolated dead tree that's in the foreground of the agony. And also what's similar is the lying of the three disciples and the formation of the rocks that Spruce has used here. So we also see, I also want to mention that Spruce's interest in Old Testament themes, I think, is similar in many ways to his fascination with primordial rocks and land formations, and that his interest was in what was mysterious and eternal. And he described what Mantegna depicted as very dramatic, and he equated that with the landscape that he would go out and look at. And in this particular work, the landscape, you see this stair stone here and the log. And in Mantegna's work, at the back of his picture, he has this it's almost like a temple. It's a building, but it's not a building. It's actually just a rock formation that's in a spiraling that ascends up to heaven. And Spruce has really kind of done the same thing. He's used the log device that Mantegna used, but he's bridging land and water in his particular work. And then it draws us to this formation. And then the moonlight, because Spruce really believed that nighttime evoked a kind of mystique and uncanniness that he wanted to convey in his pictures. Spruce one time said that isolated in nature, you begin to exist in these things somehow. And so one of the things that comes up again and again is this rock formation. It's a butte, and you can see it in this particular, this is from an early sketchbook that's in the special collections at Hammond Arts Library, Bywater Special Collection, Southern Methodist University, is that he drew this particular rock form, this with the lithophyte coming out of the top of it, and he starts recombining it in various ways. In some ways, I think that it was a stand-in for Spruce himself, almost looking out over the terrain. And there was no designation as to where he depicted this, whether it was in Texas or whether it was in northern Arkansas, because both of them could feature those kinds of rocky landscapes. But in fact, the distinction really didn't matter to Spruce, because what he started to do was combine elements from both worlds in his pictures. And here you see a different kind of combination of that rock butte, but it leans up, it takes you to these post oak trees that almost stands like crosses for contemplation, and the dry ravine leads your eye up that way, because Spruce wants us to look deeply and to contemplate his paintings, I think, in that model that Mantegna and Bellini did. And of course, they were creating paintings for public and private devotion. And Spruce is creating works in the modern 20th century, but he's, you know, as modernization has taken over, as city urban life, I think that Spruce is asking us to look more deeply into nature and its meanings. You see that rock formation again in Mending the Rock Fence, one of his few peopled landscapes and probably one of his best known ones. And as a critic once said, and I think many of you probably are aware of this, that the New York critic said the figures attain something of the dignity of a saint in a medieval painting. And I think that Spruce really believed that it reflected his belief in a strong work ethic as integral to faith and life. And here you have an older man almost handing down a tradition. They're building a winding parapet, building a wall there in northern Arkansas, but it's also a mesquite tree to the left of the canvas. And the same thing is happening here in Ozark Mountaineer, where this is, as the title would suggest, Ozark Mountaineer, we're in the northern Arkansas landscape, but we actually have a cowboy hat on the left of his foot, and then we have an agave or a century plant on the other side of the wall. And he's commingling these elements in a way that reflects his modernist subjectivity. I mean, he's not trying to transcribe the landscape in any sort of literal way. He's very open to reflecting these different symbols. And a little bit of background about this painting: it's believed by some that the figure could represent the Dallas architect David R. Williams, who originated a ranch-style home derived from the foundations of the early German and Czech houses built in Texas. Others suggest it could be Spruce himself. It looks a little similar to him. And you see that he's standing on this mud platform as he works. And this commingling of elements suggests these almost sacred elements, these sacred landscape motifs that recur again and again. And later in life, you see him depict the century plant so often. I also want to point out Spruce's skies, because there's figures and symbols in the sky. So here, if you can see it, it's a swan next to the Ozark Mountaineer's head. And it's almost, if, of course, swans have all kinds of meaning, and they can represent idealized landscapes, idealized themes, but also it's as if the figure's receiving kind of a blessing up right next to his head. And Spruce's skies, in which clouds become symbolic motifs, mirror Renaissance artists of practice of hiding elements in nature, whether it was Bellini who would place faces in rocks, or Mantegna, who would suggest zephyrs or figures in billowy masses. And so one of Andrea Mantegna's most famous hidden figures is in the scene of Saint Sebastian. And you see up in that cloud form that I've blown up on the right side, there's actually a horse and rider. And there's all kinds of interpretations about this. Some think it is referencing the horse and rider is perhaps holding a scythe, and he's representing the Book of Revelations. Others have identified him as a personification of time, or Saturn, the evil vaporous deity who showers the world in misfortune. Or perhaps the rider in the clouds is a reference to the transitoriness of life, which is a more general interpretation, and that's what it may mean. But what you start to see in Spruce's pictures is these clouds that have certain forms. And there's often in Spruce's pictures a direct correlation of what's happening in the sky as to what's happening in the subject. So if you look at the cloud formations there, it's almost like a mountain range. And these particular workers are in the Ozark Mountains. like the poet William Butler Yeats, who Spruce considered really the greatest literary figure of the modern era, Spruce wanted, like Yeats, to create a communion with an ultimate reality expressing unseen forces. And Spruce said, and Spruce was often, I'll say this too, Spruce was very reluctant to talk about his artwork. He didn't keep journals. He didn't do a lot of interviews. He didn't talk much to his family at all about his work. What I could find was often in the Hayman Arts, the Bywater Special Collections, his letters. And there are countless letters from his dealers in New York City asking him to please explain his art, to please write a description, and he won't respond. In fact, I think one response was just a very blunt interest in nature, prime factor, and that's it. But one thing he did write that I think is quite telling, he said, and he wrote it mid-career, is this quote, this problem of expressing more reality than the eye sees has so far dominated my art, end quote. And I think that we see that in all of his works when we look closely, but in particular, something like Arkansas Landscape. And he draws our eyes really to the horizon, the atmosphere that we're looking at. And I think it's a commingling of memories of living atop Adams Mountain as a child, and also creating these associations with Texas that I'll show you in just a sec. So he said that he used nighttime themes to elicit a kind of mystery. And this one is this particular painting is a very uncanny feel. It also, if you look closely, the cloud formation in the sky mirrors an angel. And then if we look at this rock formation, he's created it's a very unusual configuration of rocks. It's not, I don't think, something you find in nature, but it almost forms a cross when you look at it, the pieces combined together. And on the left side, even though this is Arkansas Landscape and we see the Ozark Mountains in the background, this is a mesquite tree planted at the left. And mesquite trees, of course, are more indigenous, and we know them as associated with Texas. So I think that Spruce was really communicating the sense of this awestruck feeling he had in nature. And to look, and this kind of work inspires that kind of contemplation. The other thing that relates to Yeats is the way that Yeats, probably one of his most famous poems created early in his career, The Lake Isle of Innisfree. Yeats was actually an Irishman living in London at the time he wrote it. And the poem gets its title from a very small uninhabited island that sits in Lough Gill, a lake in Yeats' home county of Sligo, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, Ireland, sorry. The speaker of this poem, that's Yeats himself, longs to build a simple life on Innisfree, finding peace through communion with nature. And so that Mulberry River scene, that forested escarpment that he painted that references his youth, and I think it was almost a sacred place to him, but it was also, for Spruce, I think a reminder of that growing up isolated in nature, not having to deal with adult responsibilities, but that creative foreground that he had where he could find a communion, a peace in the land. Because it comes up, even though we're in scenes of West Texas, what happens is that you'll see this form show up here in this West Texas mesa, almost in the reverse. And it's this recollection of Mulberry, this recollection of Arkansas. But it comes up as late as, that painting was the West Texas Mesa from 1938, but it shows up as late as 1957. When we're looking at, this is after Spruce has moved to Austin, he's down there teaching, and he's advanced his style, but the shape still reappears. And I think that's also this symbology that he created of the references of the interconnectedness of nature and the sacred places and these connected fields that he saw in his own mind. Now, after he moves to Arkansas, you do see Spruce start to shift his style. And it speaks to the fact that Spruce was very much attuned to his surroundings. So that greener surrounding that, we think of the hill country, he very much depicted. And Hollow Tree on the left is one of the first works he did after he moved there. And this tree is also hollowed out, just like the earlier veteran picture one I showed you, but it's a green leaf juniper. I'll also mention that I had, because Spruce's trees are hard to identify, I had a former Brit employee identify a lot of these trees for me, and I really appreciate Guy's help with that. So there you see, this is Hollow Tree. It's almost to this reference to one of his first depictions of Austin. And it doesn't look the same as those earlier, very still quality pictures. He's moved on. He's now a professor at UT. He's on to greener patches. But he's still evoking the essence of the landscape because the way he's risen in the cedar breaks, the land almost to the sky, the essence of the hill country, and thinking about that particular terrain. But as Spruce moves on, you still find these hidden figures in his paintings. And I think it would be a joy if all of us could walk through the show with Alice Spruce Merriweather, who, when she came to visit the show, was pointing out animals and hidden things in a lot of the pictures. I didn't get her a chance to talk to her about this one that I think really stands out, which is driftwood, the theme of driftwood. But I mean, he's made it so elegant and sculptural, but then this almost looks like the horse, the head of a horse right there. So there's this, always these reference points to animals, to what is in nature and how it all relates to one another. And even that hollow tree theme that we think of as Spruce, I mean, it's something indicative of the Texas landscape, right? Because of when we think about all the tornadoes and think about all that, happens to trees. This is Spruce near his home in Austin, walking through the prairie. He's taken that idea of the hollow tree from earlier on, and he's experimenting with ideas from modernism, almost looking at everyone from Cubism to Mondrian to different artists from Picasso, but still remaining grounded within the earth. You always, no matter how abstract a picture comes, you always see that horizon line in Spruce's work. Even later, and he continued throughout his career, even though he'd moved down to Austin, he continued to go to Big Bend. And this particular turtle, it's almost reminiscent of petroglyphs in the Big Bend Park, which he may have seen, or it could be a living creature. And if you think about turtles, because of their camouflage, they are typically hard to see, but Spruce has blown it up. He's flattened it. We're looking down at it. The perspective is completely modernist, completely unique. And it's one of those marvelous paintings that if you get up close to and you look at his truly sophisticated brushwork at creating this patterning that is solely Spruce. And then Spruce later, as he moved through life, he went on to look to the coastlines. They were essential coming in the 1950s to finding new territory. But his daughter often talked about that, and you see it here, that he was more interested in agitated landscapes and agitated atmospheres. And it evokes this, it gets into the kind of mystery and uncanny qualities that he was conveying in the earlier work. But now he's looking at it from the perspective of nature and the forces of nature. But he hasn't lost, and he never lost, the symbolism that he created in the sky. And if you get a chance to look closely at this painting, there's all kinds of forms that kind of emerge here. It could be like a mountain range. It could be like angelic figures, and we see that even in his later works. But he wanted to capture this essence that I think he did in really amazing ways. And even later, the wave, where you see this conventional realities basically disappeared, and he's evoking tidal forces, and he's evoking the sense of the moon drawing on the water. And you, once again, looking closely, he's interspersed. This could be the leaves of a century plant. This could be it could be a mountain range. Up here you have these frolicking figures that are angelic like. They're not necessarily as direct as some of his earlier works, but they're more abstract, but they allude to that mystique that was in nature. And then some of the later works, one of the later works in the show, the Peter Nallis Cypress from 1977. This is not necessarily the scene that he saw, but I wanted to show you what it looks like along that riverway. And if you think about the way that Spruce did his earlier, more static trees, how greatly he's evolved to create these vibrant, really almost vocal, versus his earlier pieces seeming almost quiet. And here, it's these vocal, vibrant, animated, particular trees that he's created that reflected the way that Spruce really evolved over time and changed his style and was willing to continually evolve and experiment. And by doing so, continued to create monumentally important artwork in the history of not only Texas art, but should be reconsidered in the history of American art. And I think the show ends on a note where the idea was, you've seen Spruce move from this idea of nature, the spirituality in nature, and it being static and still from the earlier work, to moving to this vibrant, almost figures and water and ocean devolving into these forms that are still recognizable, but this idea of that interrelationship he's done through a completely new stylistic realm. And I think ultimately it speaks to what Spruce was searching for, which was the transcendence in nature. And I think with that, I have reached my time limit, and I am going to send it over to see if Sarah has questions or...
Hi, Shirley. Thank you so much. This was outstanding. So I enjoyed it, and I know we've had some comments coming in, how much our audience has enjoyed it. So I do have a couple of questions that actually came through via text message. So I'm going to jump on those. We know that artists oftentimes are influencing each other, and I know you've spoken quite a bit about the greater international art influences on Spruce's career, which is enlightening. But, thinking about, like, we know Dallas 9 artists were often working in concert with each other. Who would you say are some of the big Texas artist influences with Spruce? And would Lester possibly, be one of those main artists? If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that Lester, probably more than anyone, William Lester and Spruce in their youth, very much, Spruce took his first trip to West Texas with Lester, and they remained close friends because after Spruce got a job teaching at UT Austin, he helped Lester come down and get a job there as well. So they remained close throughout their life. And I think if you look particularly at all the artists that Spruce knew, Jerry Bywaters, as well, Otis Dozier, he was close to. There's an exchange of letters between Dozier and him. I think that hidden brushwork that Lester and him very much shared in those 1930s pictures, very same. Cypress Fenn from the DMA, I almost brought it in and then took it out, that painting. I have it in the book, where that very stillness, that eerie quality of the landscape, they both shared that that kind of sensibility about the land and depicted it in that way. So I think that they influenced one another very much so, probably more than anyone else. I think if you think about what's interesting is, like, Dozier was more open to painting what was happening, like when you think of the painting, The Annual Move in the Dallas Museum of Art, about families, farming families, and his style was a little bit different. And I think, of course, Hogue was doing something with a much more stringent commentary in the 30s. Spruce knew Bywaters. They were friends. There's a really cute note from Bywaters to Spruce where after Jerry Bywaters became director of the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts, he writes Spruce a note saying, "Why didn't you tell me how much work museum work was?" with an exclamation point. And I think that's part of the reason Spruce actually took the job teaching in UT Austin is he wanted more time to paint, and he did have more time to paint after that. But I think with Bywaters, unfortunately, he just didn't, because he was so busy being a director, writing for the Dallas Morning News, professor at SMU, he just didn't have the time to paint to see how his career would have expanded over a longer period of time. Do you have more questions?
We do. We have a couple more that have come through. Can you talk a little bit about the feedback you've received on the exhibition and the book from other curators in a more national sense?
Well, I had a really positive conversation with Tyler Green, who's doing he does modern podcast, and he interviewed me Friday, and he's not certain when that's going to air. He's up in DC. He didn't have a chance to see the show yet, and he's really sad because of, the COVID-19 situation. I think that's one unfortunate thing, is this COVID-19 situation is kind of preventing more visitors from across the states than we'd like. But I've received really positive feedback talking about the strength of the show, and a lot of individuals who didn't know Spruce's work and just are in awe of what he created. And I think that's the goal of the show. I hope that this draws attention to him, and it encourages young scholars, more scholars out there to dig into Spruce, because there's a lot more to uncover. I could have spent a long time. He painted so many works, so I think there's just a lot more to delve into with Spruce that more scholars and curators should pursue.
Wonderful, thank you. And then one last question. We did have an attendee just want to know why you stopped at least the presentation today in the 70s. And if you can speak a little bit about that, and then also like how far the exhibition actually runs.
Well, the exhibition actually runs to the 70s, and part of that was I focused on Spruce in Texas. So he retires from UT in 1974, and then he starts traveling to Mexico and England. And I think that I was encapsulating Spruce in the Texas realm. Spruce painted over 800 paintings in his lifetime. And I think that his 80s work goes into different directions that were distinct and kind of farther afield from what I was trying to focus on. And I think that influence of Mexico is something to be looked at in his later work. So, there's only so much you can do with a particular show. And I felt like the 80s work went into a different arena. And, that's another subject, that's another show. So I was trying to keep it to the theme of Texas.
Got it. Thank you, Shirley. Well, we've had lots of comments coming in from the audience, just thanking you, looking forward to seeing the exhibition and how much they learned. So I just want to say thanks as well. And with that being said, I think I'm going to turn it over to Scott to
Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody and when I say that if we could do it, we would have a standing ovation for your excellent presentation. I want to encourage everybody to buy the book. I've already got it. I'm out here in Marfa, and the book is in the Paisano bookstore, so it's available a lot of places, but get it online through the museum. And please join Taco or Caseta, and I'm going to turn it over to Russ Aikman now.
Thanks. I don't have much to add. Just thanks again, Shirley. Fantastic job in your presentation. I understand, Sarah Beth, this may be a question for you. I believe that this is being recorded and will be on the Caseta website. Is that correct?
Yes, I have recorded it, so eventually it'll be available via the Caseta website, and we can also share it with Taco if y'all like to pass out. So it might take a little bit, but we will get that up.
Fantastic. So as I said earlier, I really, if you can, go see the show while it's still up. I think it's up till the 1st of November, if I remember correctly. Well worth the trip if you can do so safely. And buy the catalog, as Scott just mentioned. And that's it again. Fantastic job, Shirley. Thanks everybody for all your work. Sarah for all the technical details and pulling this together. Hopefully we'll do similar joint sessions in the future. So everybody be safe, take care.